Tell me. I pulled the access logs from last night, Tesser said, her fingers clacking rapidly across her mechanical keyboard. Someone breached the human resources portal at 1:45 in the morning. They did not hack the firewall. They walked right through the front door using an old administrative security token, a token that was supposed to be decommissioned over 6 months ago. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. An old token. My parents did not possess the technical literacy to execute an internal system breach, let alone intercept an administrative token. They had a ghost inside my machine, a ghost who knew exactly which digital doors were left unlocked. Revoke all existing tokens immediately. I ordered force a global password reset for every single employee profile, starting with the executive suite. Then I need you to initiate Protocol Epsilon. There was a brief pause on the line. Protocol Epsilon meant we were completely abandoning our primary financial arteries. Are you sure? Tesser asked. If we wrote through the dark site, we burn our standard payment history for the quarter. Execute it. I said flatly. The primary accounts are totally compromised. Protocol Epsilon was my absolute worst-case scenario architecture. It involved Granite Vale Capital, a heavily armored specialized corporate credit facility designed specifically for catastrophic business interruptions. It was not a traditional bank account. It was a dormant, high-interest reserve line of credit built to guarantee payroll in the event of a crippling ransomware attack or a natural disaster. It cost me a small fortune in retainer fees every year just to keep it active. But right now, it was the only clean money I had left. I ended the call and walked straight back into the executive suite. Marisol had relocated to a secondary workstation while Colin was busy printing physical copies of the audit logs. My parents were still sitting in the glass room, their faces pale and furious, flanked by two large men in dark security uniforms. I did not even glance in their direction. Marcel, I need to clear a path for an external drawdown, I said, leaning over the counter. I am pulling payroll from a secondary credit facility with Granite Vale Capital to bypass the frozen accounts. Marisol looked up from her tablet, her dark eyes evaluating my strategy. That is a brilliant contingency, she noted, her tone purely professional. However, we have a significant legal hurdle to clear first. She tapped her screen, bringing up a newly decoded section of my parents' fraudulent submission. Your family did not just submit a request to transfer a specific sum of money, Marisol explained, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a dense paragraph of legalese. They submitted a formal petition to be recognized by this institution as the recurring payroll administrative custodian for Cinder Ward. I stared at the words on the screen. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. That is secured lending terminology, I whispered, the forensic pieces snapping together with horrifying clarity. Exactly, Marisol confirmed. They were not trying to steal your money just for today. They were attempting to collateralize your ongoing payroll structure. If Yon Reserve Bank officially flags your company as having an active dispute over operational capacity, Granite Vale Capital will see that flag on the interbank network. If Granite Vale sees a dispute, they will instantly freeze your reserve line to protect their own exposure. Your backup plan will be dead on arrival. I need paper, I demanded, turning to Colin. Print every standard affidavit of exclusive control you have. Print the biometric verification forms. Print the corporate indemnification waivers. Colin scrambled to the heavy-duty laser printer, pulling fresh, warm documents from the tray. I grabbed a black pen and began signing my name aggressively and precisely utilizing my current, legally binding signature without the middle initial. I initialed every single page, legally asserting my unquestioned singular authority over the limited liability company. Change my internal contacts. I ordered Colin while I signed. Purge the old family phone numbers. Delete the secondary physical addresses. Update the security questions to factors only I could possibly know. I want a complete digital scrub of every single linked corporate account under my name. Erase their existence from my company entirely, Colin typed furiously, processing the overrides with Marisol standing right over his shoulder, validating my biometric thumbprint on a digital pad. Within 10 minutes, the legal firewall was entirely rebuilt. The affidavit were scanned and time-stamped, securely locking the internal compliance dispute. The interbank warning flags were suppressed. The path to Granite Vale Capital was officially clear. I let out a slow, controlled breath, the first real breath I had taken since 6:07 this morning. We were stable. The money was safe. My employees would be paid before the banks closed. But the moment of relief was violently shattered by a sudden blaring alarm from Colin's terminal. The screen flashed crimson red for the second time today. Colin gasped, his hands flying off the keyboard. "MS. Lopez, what is it?" I demanded, my voice snapping back to a razor-sharp edge. "There is a new external routing request," Colin stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief behind his glasses. "It is not hitting your primary accounts. It just hit the Granite Vale Capital Reserve line. Someone had just attempted to intercept my emergency backup funds." "Show me the destination," I ordered, rounding the desk to stare directly at the monitor. The screen displayed an active wire transfer attempt, trying to drain the exact dollar amount of my payroll from the Granite Vale credit facility. The destination routing number did not belong to my employees. It did not belong to Hyam Reserve Bank. It belonged to an entirely different corporate entity. The sheer scale of the ambush finally revealed itself, cold and terrifying. The morning freeze was never the entire plan. It was merely the opening move. They knew I would lock down the primary accounts. They knew I was smart enough to stop the initial transfer. And they knew, because of the ghost operating inside my system, that I had a massive untouched line of credit sitting in the dark with Granite Vale Capital. Their true objective was not to casually steal a single payroll batch. Their objective was to force me into a corner, watch me activate my final financial lifeline, and then hijack the lifeline itself. They were intentionally manufacturing a total inescapable liquidity crisis. If they could drain the reserve, Cinder Ward would have zero cash, zero credit, and zero options. By Monday, I would be entirely broken. I would be staring at total corporate ruin, unable to pay my staff, unable to operate. And right at that exact moment of maximum despair, my parents would conveniently step out of the shadows, offering to save my company with the very funds they had just stolen from me, demanding absolute control of my firm in exchange for their miraculous help. They were not just trying to rob me. They were trying to break me to the point where I would willingly hand them the keys to my own kingdom. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation in the executive suite began to recede, leaving behind a cold, heavy ache in my chest. Marisol Vance and her security personnel had successfully fortified the perimeter around the Granite Vale Capital Reserve line. The money was finally definitively secured, but a secured perimeter only matters if the enemy is on the outside. My enemy had a key to the front door. I retreated back to the soundproofed client consultation booth, shutting the heavy glass door to block out the sterile hum of the banking lobby. I dialed Marcus, my lead network security architect. He was already deep inside the server logs, tracking the phantom request that had tried to drain the reserve account. "I need the physical device identity for the internal portal breach," I told him, my voice devoid of the sharp urgency from earlier. The pace of the war had shifted from a frantic firefight to a dark, methodical autopsy. Someone generated an authorized application programming interface call. I want to know exactly what machine they used to do it. "I have the packet data," Marcus replied, the rapid clacking of his mechanical keyboard echoing through the phone speaker. "I am tracing the media access control address. It is not a spoofed mobile device or an external remote desktop protocol. The ping originated from an authenticated internal machine, specifically an executive-tier operational laptop, whose machine Marcus. There was a heavy on the line. The hardware registry assigns it to Grant Heller." The name hit me with the blunt, crushing force of a physical blow. Grant Heller, my former chief operating officer. Grant had exited Cinder Ward exactly 6 months ago. His departure was officially framed to the industry as a mutual separation based on strategic differences. But the reality was a bitter, deeply toxic severing of ties. Grant had spent his final year trying to convince me to sell the firm to a massive corporate roll-up group. He wanted a spectacular 8-figure buyout. He wanted to cash out and walk away. I refused. Cinder Ward was not a disposable asset to be flipped to private equity firms. It was an institution I had built from nothing when I permanently killed the acquisition talks. Brad resigned in a quiet, seething rage. Upon his exit, he had returned his primary workstation, his access badges, and his corporate phone. But he had claimed his secondary travel laptop was permanently lost during a layover in Atlanta. It was not lost. It was a Trojan horse deliberately kept alive and buried deep within my network architecture. Lock that machine out of the domain permanently, I instructed Marcus, feeling the deep, sickening sting of a betrayal I thought I had survived half a year ago. Then I want you to pull Grant's archived encrypted communication logs from his final 3 weeks at the firm, bypass the standard legal hold protocol, crack the shadow files. Decrypting the restricted archives took several long, agonizing minutes. I stood by the glass window of the booth, watching my parents sitting in the distance, still guarded by Heian Reserve security. They looked small now, pathetic even, but the data Marcus began feeding back to me proved they were anything but harmless. Grant had not simply walked away in anger. He had meticulously drafted an instruction manual for my destruction. "Piper, you need to see this," Marcus said, his usually stoic voice laced with absolute disbelief. He began forwarding the decrypted message threads directly to my secure mobile device. I opened the files. It was a master class in corporate espionage executed by the second in command of my own risk management firm. Grant had established a secure encrypted email back channel. The primary recipient on the other end of those threads was Rafael Lopez, my father. I read the exchanges, the words blurring slightly as the sheer magnitude of the conspiracy crystallized. Grant had handed over a complete structural map of my company's financial arteries. He provided my exact biweekly payroll schedule detailing the precise hour the automated clearinghouse batches were processed by the bank. He forwarded the blank vendor onboarding forms necessary to establish a new pay. He provided Colin Reed's direct contact information outlining the branch manager's specific schedule and professional weaknesses. Most devastatingly, Grant detailed the exact internal bypass protocols required to alter a payment routing without triggering an immediate executive alert to my phone. He knew exactly where the blind spots were because he had helped me design the security system. Grant understood the psychology of a founder better than anyone. He knew that the ultimate vulnerability of any chief executive officer is the day her employees expect their paychecks. If a firm misses just one single payroll cycle, the internal panic is instantaneous. Trust evaporates. Employees begin updating their resumes. The rumor mill bleeds into the industry and clients begin to sever their contracts to avoid the fallout of an insolvent partner. Grant believed that if he could orchestrate a localized liquidity crisis, the resulting reputational pressure would crush my resolve. I would be backed into a corner, completely vulnerable, and forced to accept an external administrator or an emergency fire sale to save the company. But why would my parents coordinate with my bitter exarchner? What was the connective tissue between a disgruntled former executive and two retired parents looking for a payout? I opened a background search application on my phone, bypassing my internal network entirely to pull professional affiliations. I ran a deep query on Grant Heller's current employment status. After leaving Cinder, he had quietly joined a boutique corporate restructuring firm as a senior strategic consultant. The firm specialized in acquiring distressed assets and providing emergency bridge capital to failing businesses. I dug into the firm's holding structure, tracing the limited liability partnerships all the way up to the managing director. When the name finally populated on my screen, a cold shiver traced the length of my spine. The managing director of the restructuring firm was Ross Danner. Ross Danner was my sister Bianca's husband, my own brother-in-law. The entire architecture of the ambush was finally visible, laid bare under the harsh light of the investigation. The scope was breathtaking. This was never a simple case of my parents overstepping their boundaries. It was a fully synchronized multi-front corporate siege. My parents provided the legal foundation, the historical signatures, and the necessary blood relation to feign a legitimate family continuity crisis to the banking institution. Grant Heller provided the operational blueprints, the internal access, and the digital backdoor required to intercept the funds. Ross Danner provided the financial vehicle, the legal restructuring framework, and the ultimate incentive to absorb my company's cash flow. They were all standing together on the same side of the battlefield. My mother, my father, my brother-in-law, and my former partner, a coalition of the people I had trusted most, united by a singular, ruthless objective to break me. My phone buzzed again. It was Tessa Boone. I answered, my voice flat and hollow. "Piper," Tessa said slowly, her tone carrying the weight of a sudden dark realization. "I was just reviewing the old compliance sprint records from last year to see what else Grant might have had access to. I just remembered something from a strategy meeting about 8 months ago before he resigned." "Tell me," I said. "Grant pitched a new operational safeguard model," Tessa explained, her voice dropping. "He called it a family continuity backstop. It was a theoretical structure where a founder facing a severe operational crisis could temporarily assign fiduciary control of the payroll systems to a family-owned entity. He argued it would protect the core assets from external creditors during a restructuring phase." I closed my eyes, resting my forehead against the cool glass of the booth. I remembered the pitch perfectly. We had been sitting in the main conference room. Grant had presented a glossy slide deck. I had killed the proposal before he even finished the presentation. I called it a dangerously vague concept, a blatant circumvention of standard corporate governance, and a massive invitation for internal embezzlement. I had ordered him to scrap the entire project. Grant had not scrapped it. He had simply taken his rejected compliance model, polished the rough edges, personalized the variables, and weaponized it against the very person who told him it was dangerous. He sold the blueprint to my family. The elaborate trap I was fighting today was not a brilliant new invention. It was an old idea, recycled and aimed directly at the most painful weak point of any person who builds a company from nothing: the sacred obligation to pay the people who work for you. They took my duty to my team and turned it into a loaded weapon aimed directly at my back. I opened my eyes, staring out across the lobby. The frantic, desperate energy of the morning was completely gone. In its place was a terrifying absolute clarity. The betrayal was no longer a matter of broken familial bonds or emotional wounds. It was a matter of structural leverage. They had built a machine to destroy me. Now I understood exactly how the machine worked. I stepped out of the soundproof client consultation booth, leaving the echoes of the internal network breach behind me. The main executive lobby of the bank felt distinctly different now. The chaotic, frantic energy of an active crisis had evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a crime scene. Marcel Vance was waiting for me near the polished mahogany desk. She was no longer alone. Standing beside her was a tall, incredibly sharp-looking man holding a leather folio. He did not possess the nervous energy of a branch manager. He carried the quiet, lethal authority of a senior litigator. Marisol gestured toward him. "He is the senior legal counsel for the regional banking division," she explained, her voice low and entirely devoid of pleasantries. "We have been running a concurrent external investigation while you were securing your internal perimeter. We bypassed the standard processing queues and pulled the interbank communication logs for the newly formed family holding company." The legal counsel opened his folio and extracted a single heavily printed document. He did not hand it to me immediately. He placed it flat on the table, treating it like a piece of highly volatile evidence. "We traced the destination routing data of the shell company your parents established," the counsel stated smoothly. "We did not just look at where they wanted to put your money today. We looked at who they were talking to yesterday. This is a decrypted transmission log between their new entity and a private credit fund located in Chicago. It is a term sheet for a leveraged commercial loan." I looked down at the paper. The text was dense, filled with aggressive financial covenants and predatory lending jargon, but my eyes instantly locked onto the summary paragraph. My mother and my father had not simply walked into a private equity office asking for a personal favor. They had constructed a massive fraudulent corporate narrative. They formally declared to the shadow lenders that their new entity was an established, highly capitalized fiduciary services provider. They claimed they were finalizing contracts to take over the recurring operational disbursements for a portfolio of mid-sized commercial enterprises. And sitting right at the top of that fabricated portfolio, serving as the crown jewel of their collateral, was my firm. They had legally designated my company as their anchor client. They promised the private lenders a guaranteed, uninterrupted river of cash. I whispered, reading the exact terminology they had used to sell my life's work. Precisely, Marisol confirmed. But private credit funds do not disperse capital based on promises. They require a proof of concept. They require a live transaction. I scanned the next section of the document, and the true devastating mathematics of their trap finally materialized. The clause was highlighted in stark yellow ink. If my payroll routed successfully through their holding account just one single time today, the private lender would instantly recognize the entire fiduciary portfolio as active and verified. Upon that single successful clearing, the shadow fund was contractually obligated to release a massive tranche of bridge funding. The amount requested was $6.8 million. The disbursement deadline was explicitly set for 5 in the afternoon today. They did not want to steal my payroll to keep it. They only needed to hold it for a few hours. They needed my employees' salaries to act as a living, breathing prop to trigger a multi-million-dollar payout before the closive looked up from the document, my mind racing through the financial connections. Where was the bridge funding supposed to go? $6.8 million is not a retirement nest egg. That is institutional rescue capital. The legal counsel turned to the second page of the term sheet. The designated beneficiary of the bridge loan is a commercial real estate holding trust. The trust is currently managing a massive, deeply distressed urban redevelopment project on the south side of the city. We ran a cross-reference on the managing partners of that specific development. The primary stakeholder is Ross Danner. The name hung in the cold, sterile air of the bank lobby. Ross Danner, my sister Bianca's husband. The redevelopment project had been the crown jewel of his real estate portfolio, a massive gamble that had been quietly bleeding capital for over 2 years. The supply chain delays, the skyrocketing interest rates, and a series of brutal zoning disputes had turned his empire into a massive financial sinkhole. But Ross going bankrupt did not explain why my parents were willing to commit federal wire fraud. I looked closer at the guarantor signatures listed on the collateral documents. There it was. My father had not just offered moral support to his son-in-law. Raphael had co-signed the mezzanine debt. He had pledged his own personal assets, his investment accounts, and the equity in his own home to secure the real estate loans for Ross. If the development project went completely under, Ross would be wiped out, but Raphael would be dragged down right alongside him. My parents were staring at total irreversible bankruptcy. They were weeks, perhaps days, away from losing the opulent lifestyle they had spent 4 decades building. They needed a massive injection of cash to satisfy the creditors, and they needed it today. But the absolute worst part of the betrayal was buried in the fine print at the very bottom of the contract. The legal counsel tapped his pen against a specific subclause governing the terms of the private loan. "Read the security agreement," he instructed quietly. I read the words, and the blood drained completely from my face. To secure the $6.8 million, the private credit fund demanded a blanket lien against all managed operating cash flow flowing through the family entity. "Do you understand what this legally implies?" the counsel asked. I understood it with perfect, horrifying clarity. If my money had touched their account this morning, it would have legally mixed with their secured assets. The private lender would have registered a formal claim over my company's payment routing. It meant that every single time I attempted to run payroll next month or the month after that, the shadow fund could legally freeze the transfer, claiming those funds were disputed collateral for my father's toxic real estate debt. A single reroute today would have permanently infected my company. They were perfectly willing to turn my future revenue into a battleground for their creditors. They were going to use my employees' rent money, their grocery budgets, and their medical insurance premiums as a sacrificial blood transfusion to resuscitate a sinking family empire. The betrayal had completely transcended emotional cruelty. This was not about parents failing to love their daughter. This was a calculated structural harvest. They looked at me and saw nothing but a highly profitable resource to be mined until it collapsed. My mobile phone vibrated violently against the mahogany table. The caller identification displayed Eleanor's name. She was calling me from her mobile device, sitting less than 50 feet away in the secured glass conference room, entirely unaware that I was currently staring at the autopsy of her financial crimes. I did not reach for the phone immediately. I looked at the senior legal counsel. "If I answer this," I asked, my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of winter ice, "are we legally permitted to record the audio under state consent laws?" The counsel nodded firmly. "As long as you are a direct party to the conversation and you provide explicit consent on your end, it is entirely admissible. Put the device on speaker." I pressed the green icon and set the phone down on the table. I did not say hello. I let the dead air stretch across the connection. "Piper." My mother's voice crackled through the speaker. The soft, manipulative velvet was entirely gone. She sounded frantic, breathless and vicious. I remained absolutely silent. "You need to tell the bank to release the hold right now," Eleanor demanded, her voice rising in pitch, echoing faintly from the glass room down the hall. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You are destroying your sister. This was Bianca's last chance to save her family. Ross is going to lose absolutely everything by the end of the day. And you are sitting there in your glass tower, letting your own family drown because of your absolute coldness." She was weaponizing guilt, trying to shift the blame for their impending ruin onto my shoulders. She wanted me to feel responsible for my sister's tears. She wanted me to believe that protecting my own staff was an act of unforgivable selfishness. "You are tearing this family apart," Eleanor hissed through the speaker, her breathing ragged. "If you do not authorize that transfer before the afternoon deadline, we will never recover from this. You are signing our death warrant over a minor administrative delay." I looked at Marisol. I looked at the legal counsel. They were silently documenting every single word, capturing the undeniable proof of criminal intent. Eleanor was not pleading ignorance. She was explicitly acknowledging the deadline. She was directly tying the unauthorized routing request to the survival of a third-party real estate venture. She was confessing to the exact economic motives we had just uncovered on the term sheet. I did not soften. I did not yell back. I did not ask her how she could possibly do this to me. Seeking closure from a parasite is a spectacular waste of time. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice did not shake. It was the calmest, most terrifying sound I had ever produced in my entire life. "The transfer is permanently canceled," I stated. "The internal breach has been sealed. The federal incident report has been filed. Do not ever call this number again." I terminated the connection. I looked down at the term sheet one last time, feeling the final decaying threads of my family entirely sever and turned to dust. They had built a spectacular trap, but they forgot one crucial detail. They taught me exactly how to survive in a room full of predators. The atmosphere in the bank lobby had irreversibly shifted. It was no longer a contained corporate emergency. The sterile, polished environment felt less like a financial institution and more like the command center of a federal war room. Marisol Vance stood completely still before the secondary terminal, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitor. She was not looking at my specific account architecture anymore. The regional legal counsel stood right beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression carved from stone. Marisol had initiated a macro-level algorithmic sweep across the entire regional banking infrastructure. She isolated the precise, highly unusual legal phrasing my father had utilized in his forged documents. "The term family continuity backstop is not standard banking nomenclature," Marisol murmured, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. "It is a highly customized, fabricated legal concept. If they deployed it against you this morning, I want to know if they tested it anywhere else on our network." The server took exactly 45 seconds to process the query across thousands of commercial accounts. When the results populated on the screen, the silence in the room became thick enough to choke on. There were 2 additional algorithmic matches. "You are not the first target," the legal counsel stated, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of a massive legal escalation. Marisol expanded the data logs. Two separate commercial entities, both founded and operated by single-member chief executives, received nearly identical emergency continuity packets within the last 30 days. She pulled up the first profile. It was a mid-sized logistics and freight management company operating out of the northern suburbs. The logistics firm caught the anomaly, Marisol explained, tracing the transaction history. Their chief financial officer noticed the unauthorized routing modification request 2 hours before the automated clearinghouse batch was finalized. They assumed it was a sophisticated external phishing scam, killed the transfer, and locked their external portals. Marisol clicked to the second profile. It belonged to a boutique medical supply distributor. The data on this screen was painted in a grim, unforgiving red. The medical supplier was not as fortunate, Marisol said, her tone clinical and detached. Exactly 2 weeks ago, a portion of their external vendor payable funds was successfully diverted. The money did not go to their legitimate suppliers. It routed directly into the newly minted holding account belonging to Lopez Continuity Services Limited Liability Company. The medical supplier had not recognized the theft as a hostile corporate action. They had flagged the missing vendor payment as a routine administrative processing error, a simple glitch in the banking software. They were quietly waiting on an internal audit, completely unaware that their operational capital had been siphoned off by a shadow entity. The terrifying reality of the situation washed over me, cold and absolute. Within the span of a few short hours, my entire understanding of the battlefield had been violently rewritten. I was not just a daughter betrayed by desperate parents in a moment of panic. I was the final massive payload in a highly systematic, rigorously tested chain of corporate fraud. The logistics firm and the medical supplier were the beta tests. My family and Grant Heller had utilized those smaller companies to probe the automated defenses of the banking institution. They needed to see exactly what kind of paperwork triggered a manual administrative review and what kind of fraudulent digital notary seal could slip through the automated cracks. Once they successfully extracted funds from the medical supplier without triggering a catastrophic system alarm, they knew their pipeline was fully viable. They had refined their weapon, polished the methodology, and aimed the upgraded system directly at my bi-weekly payroll. The regional counsel did not hesitate. He picked up his mobile device and bypassed the standard reporting channels, dialing a direct encrypted line. "I am bringing in the Federal Financial Crimes Liaison," he announced to the room. "This is no longer a localized dispute over operational capacity. We have forged legal instruments. We have the fraudulent misrepresentation of fiduciary services. We have the deliberate interception of recurring corporate disbursements, and we have a confirmed repeated approach model operating across multiple commercial victims. This is a systemic wire fraud operation." While the counsel briefed the federal authorities on the phone, Marisol continued to dissect the digital corpses of the other two targeted companies. She was hunting for the connective tissue. What links a risk management firm, a freight logistics company, and a medical supplier? Marisol asked aloud, her eyes darting across the cross-referenced ledgers. They operate in entirely different sectors. They do not share supply chains. Pull their external vendor histories, I instructed, my voice incredibly calm, fueled by a dark forensic adrenaline. Look for consulting invoices paid within the last 90 days. Marisol filtered the accounts, payable ledgers for both the logistics firm and the medical supplier. A single identical vendor name materialized on both screens. It was the boutique corporate restructuring firm, the exact firm where my former chief operating officer, Grant Heller, currently served as a senior strategic advisor. Grant's consulting invoices proved he was the architect of the hunt. He used his position at the restructuring firm to gain temporary advisory access to mid-sized businesses. He screened the prey. He identified the companies with exhausted founders, thin human resources departments, and a heavy reliance on automated banking features. He extracted their internal routing schematics and handed the blueprints directly to my parents, who then executed the legal and financial ambush. But as the data proved Grant's involvement, a much darker, far more painful realization began to claw its way into my mind. Grant could identify the technical vulnerabilities, but he did not have the social capital to introduce himself to these specific founders out of nowhere. Someone had to bridge the gap. My memory violently snapped back to a brisk evening late last autumn. It was the annual Regional Commercial Founders Gala, a highly exclusive networking event hosted in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel. I had invited my parents to attend as my personal guests. I had wanted them to see the world I inhabited. I had wanted them to share in the professional respect I had earned. I closed my eyes and the memories played back with agonizing high-definition clarity. I remembered the clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the low hum of classical music. I remembered my mother Elena wearing a stunning evening gown, pouring a glass of wine for a visibly exhausted tech founder. She had smiled with such profound feigned maternal sympathy, gently asking him how he managed the stress of a growing payroll with such a small administrative team. The founder, desperate for a sympathetic ear, had poured out his operational anxieties to her. I remembered my father, Raphael, standing near the carving station, clapping the chief executive of that exact logistics firm on the shoulder. He had projected the ultimate aura of a proud, wealthy patriarch, casually asking the man which financial institution he trusted to handle his massive capital flow. Those moments, which I had deeply cherished as instances of pure family pride, were nothing but predatory reconnaissance missions. The networking galas, the charity dinners, the quiet cocktail hours I had brought them into. They had used my own invitations as hunting grounds. They stood in the center of my professional sanctuary, smiling warmly at my peers while methodically cataloging their vulnerabilities. They listened to stories of burnout, noted which banks were being used, and mapped out the operational weaknesses of the people I respected. They spent months learning how to exploit the absolute trust and access I had so willingly, so lovingly handed to them. The sheer depravity of the exploitation should have broken me. It was designed to break me. But standing there in the cold light of the bank lobby, staring at the irrefutable digital proof of their syndicate, the suffocating pain of familial betrayal suddenly evaporated. You cannot grieve a connection that was entirely fabricated. You cannot be emotionally wounded by a machine. And my family, along with my former partner and my brother-in-law, were nothing more than a mechanical fraud syndicate. The scattered, chaotic pieces of the morning were no longer terrifying anomalies. The aggressive corporate motive, the bitter insider, the newly registered shell entity, the desperate real estate debt, and the targeted beta tests had all perfectly aligned. As the federal liaison's voice echoed thinly from the council's phone, outlining the immediate asset seizure protocols, I realized the board had entirely flipped. My parents had relied on my emotional collapse. They had built their entire timeline on the assumption that I would panic, that I would be blinded by the shock of their betrayal, and that I would surrender to their pressure before the afternoon deadline. They did not realize they had just handed a master risk compliance auditor the complete unfiltered blueprint of their own destruction. I was no longer a bleeding target trying to survive an ambush. I finally possessed something infinitely more powerful than grief and vastly more dangerous than anger. I had the complete picture. I looked at Marisol Vance and the regional legal counsel with absolute clarity. The time for building defensive walls was over. When you are dealing with a coordinated syndicate that intimately knows your internal architecture, playing pure defense only delays the inevitable. If you block one path, they will continuously probe the perimeter until they find another microscopic crack in the foundation. To truly neutralize a threat of this magnitude, you have to open a door they cannot resist walking through, and you have to wire that door with high explosives. We needed to let them step into their own demise. I told Marisol we were going to drop the total communication blackout. We needed to manufacture a highly controlled weaponized leak. I dialed Marcus, my lead network security architect, who was still monitoring the severed connection from Grant Heller's ghost laptop. I instructed Marcus to establish a quarantined email pathway, one that was highly visible to any lingering internal surveillance, but completely disconnected from the actual banking application programming interface. It was a digital harpoon. We typed it out in plain unencrypted text. The internal memorandum stated that the Granite Vale Capital Reserve facility was primed and fully operational. I explicitly wrote, that the manual drawdown for the entire company payroll would be executed at exactly 20 minutes to 4 in the afternoon. Then I added the poison pill. I included a sentence stating that the transaction would clear automatically provided no secondary legal disputes regarding executive authorization were registered in the internal system before the deadline. We sent the email down the compromised pipe. We gave them the exact time, the exact location of the money, and the exact method required to stop it. We waited. The digital clock on the wall moved with agonizing slowness. At exactly 15 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the trap snapped shut. Marcus flagged a massive external data push hitting the company's servers. It was an anonymous company-wide email blast. Every single employee at Cinderward Compliance Group received it simultaneously. The subject line was fully capitalized and designed to induce immediate terror. It warned of a catastrophic liquidity failure. The body of the email, masquerading as a confidential leak from outside legal counsel, claimed that I was actively being removed from my position due to severe financial mismanagement and that an outside payroll custodian would be seizing control of all corporate assets by the evening. It was Grant's masterpiece. He was trying to incite a full-scale corporate riot. He needed my staff to panic, to flood the Human Resources Department with demands, to threaten mass resignations, and to create a highly documented internal dispute that he could then leverage to freeze the Granite Vale funds. He wanted the noise of a terrified workforce to validate the fake continuity documents my parents had submitted. But Grant had spent his entire career underestimating the people who actually built the foundation of the firm. He expected a hysterical mutiny. He received absolute deafening silence because I had sent that short factual memorandum at the very beginning of the morning crisis. My employees were already inoculated against the panic. They knew the perimeter was secure and they trusted the chain of command. Instead of calling their mortgage brokers or screaming at their managers, over 50 distinct employees simply forwarded the anonymous threat directly to our internal compliance and legal department. There was no chaos. There was no operational halt. There was only a quiet, highly disciplined gathering of forensic evidence. The psychological weapon completely misfired, leaving a massive, highly visible digital footprint in its wake. While the failed email blast was still echoing through the server, Marcus logged on to the origin point. It was not routed through a sophisticated international proxy server. The sender was arrogant and hurried. The Internet Protocol address traced back to a premium short-term commercial workspace located in the downtown financial district. Marcus pulled the current lease ledger for that specific suite. It was rented by the hour, paid for with a corporate credit card registered to the boutique restructuring firm managed by Ross Danner. The loop was perfectly closed. My brother-in-law's firm had just formally launched a cyber assault against my employees. While Marcus gathered the digital footprints, my external corporate litigator was already standing inside a federal courthouse, armed with the intercepted term sheet, the forged digital notary logs, and now the traced cyber attack directly linking the restructuring firm to the extortion attempt. He filed an emergency ex parte motion. Within 45 minutes, a federal judge signed a temporary restraining order. It was a brutal, ironclad legal mandate. It explicitly barred Rafael Lopez, Elena Lopez, Grant Heller, Ross Danner, and their fabricated limited liability company from asserting any legal, financial, or administrative authority over Cinder Ward. It carried the immediate threat of federal contempt and incarceration. Back inside the bank, the atmosphere within the glass conference room was growing violently desperate. My parents could feel the silence. They knew their deadline for the Chicago Bridge loan was rapidly approaching. Without my payroll crossing their ledger, their $6.8 million rescue package would vanish, leaving them to drown in Ross' toxic real estate debt. I watched through the glass as Raphael stood up, his face flushed red, waving a yellowed, archaic stack of papers at Colin Reeve. It was the original seed capital loan contract from 10 years ago. They had dug up the ancient document to argue that a deeply buried, long-forgotten covenant granted them emergency supervisory rights over my ledger in the event of institutional instability. They were trying to manufacture the dispute. I had baited them with using a decade-old technicality. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush into the room to argue with him. I simply waited. I realized then that the most devastating element of absolute retaliation is not volume. It is not screaming your pain into the face of your betrayer or demanding an apology they are incapable of giving. It is timing. It is the cold mathematical precision of letting them build their final lie, letting them place all their weight upon it and then quietly removing the floor. Just as my father slammed the decade-old contract onto the mahogany table, demanding Colin halt the granite veil transfer, the heavy glass door of the suite swung open. My corporate litigator walked in, bypassing my parents entirely. He did not say a single word to them. He simply placed the freshly stamped federal injunction directly on top of their archaic loan document. The court order arrived exactly 4 minutes before the payroll was scheduled to route. Every single lie, every forged signature, and every manipulative threat was violently, permanently shattered right in front of their eyes, just seconds before they thought they had won. The clock hit exactly 12 minutes 4 in the afternoon. I was no longer standing in the sterile defensive perimeter of the Heian Reserve lobby. I had crossed the city, ascending to the penthouse executive suite of the private credit fund that held Ross Danner's financial life in its hands. Inside their sprawling glass-walled boardroom, the architects of my supposed destruction were gathered, watching the minutes tick down to the 5:00 wired deadline. Ross was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, sweating heavily through his tailored suit, waiting desperately for his bridge funding to clear. My father sat at the head of the heavy oak table, exuding the manufactured, arrogant confidence of a patriarch who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. He was waiting for me to walk through the door, completely broken, ready to sign my company away just to ensure my staff could feed their families. My mother sat right beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, fully expecting her daughter to finally bend the knee, surrender the firm, and choose the survival of the family over her own independence. They expected me to arrive alone, panicked and begging for a resolution. Instead, the heavy mahogany double doors swung open, and I walked in flanked by a firing squad. I was not alone. Marisol Vance flanked my right side, her expression carved from absolute ice. The regional legal counsel for the bank walked to my left. Directly behind them, carrying a sealed tamper-proof leather briefcase, was a special agent from the Federal Financial Crimes Division, walking alongside my own lead corporate litigator. The smug anticipation in the boardroom vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults at my parents. I simply stepped aside and let my litigator approach the long oak table. He unlatched the briefcase and began laying the sealed evidence directly in front of the private credit fund's senior managing partners. It was an overwhelming, insurmountable mountain of forensic data. He dropped the fabricated continuity packet. He placed the digital notary logs proving the facial recognition failure. He presented the Internet Protocol traces from the burner email sent directly from Ross' own rented office space. He laid out the decrypted communications detailing Grant Heller's precise internal instructions. He showed them the metadata proving the signature forgery. And finally, the absolute crown jewel of their ruin, the fraudulent loan application, where my parents explicitly lied to this very credit fund, claiming their newly minted holding company was already legally managing the payroll for multiple mid-sized enterprises. The senior partners of the private credit fund did not even look at my family. They read the summary sheet, looked at the federal agent standing in their boardroom, and immediately signaled their compliance officer. The $6.8 million disbursement was permanently frozen on the spot. They did not freeze it as a favor to me. They froze it because they realized the collateral they had been promised was built entirely on a foundation of aggressive, undeniable federal wire fraud. The moment the private equity partners severed the financial lifeline, the syndicate instantly cannibalized itself. Grant Heller, the man who had engineered the digital back door, was sitting in the corner of the room. He took one look at the federal agent and completely snapped. He did not wait for a formal interrogation. To save his own skin, he started talking, his voice trembling as he frantically tried to secure a plea deal before the handcuffs came out. Grant confessed right there in the boardroom. He admitted he had stolen the decommissioned administrative token. He confessed to feeding the internal routing architecture to my parents, and he revealed the ultimate payoff. He had been promised a massive slice of equity in my firm once. I was forced into a distressed sale. He sold me out for a theoretical payout that had just evaporated into thin air. I did not stay to watch them scramble. I did not stay to listen to my mother cry or my father attempt to yell his way out of a federal indictment. I turned my back on them, walked out of the boardroom, and took the elevator down to the street level. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air just as the digital clock on my phone rolled over to exactly 37 minutes 4 in the afternoon. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was a single encrypted text message from Tesser Boone. The Granite Vale Capital Reserve drawdown was complete. The emergency payroll batch had successfully cleared the interbank network across the city. My employees were receiving their direct deposits exactly on time, to the exact cent, to the exact correct people. The money had flowed safely to my team without touching my family's corrupt holding company for a single solitary minute. I stood on the pavement and drafted my final company-wide memorandum. It was short, entirely factual, and completely devoid of drama. I confirmed the successful completion of the payroll cycle, thanked the team for their absolute professionalism during the morning's brief administrative delay, and closed the ticket. That was the public face of the victory. The private execution happened silently behind closed doors. Over the next 48 hours, I systematically amputated my family from every single aspect of my existence. I revoked every old guarantor agreement. I severed every shared financial contact. I scrubbed my home deed, my personal trusts, and my emergency medical directives. I stripped them of any legal, financial, or informational access to my life. I erased them with the cold, ruthless efficiency they had inadvertently taught me to use. My mother and father genuinely believed that my payroll was the ultimate leash. They thought they could use my fundamental duty to my employees to drag me down to my knees. But they were wrong. The payroll did not break me. It became the definitive ledger that exposed their entire fraudulent syndicate. It collapsed their leverage, destroyed their real estate empire, and left them facing federal charges. It left me standing entirely alone in the world. I had lost my parents, my sister, and any illusion of a family I ever had. But as I looked up at the towering glass buildings of the city, I realized exactly what I had kept. I kept my company, I kept my honor, and I kept the absolute undeniable right to never ever let them touch me again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy situation.